Hello, I'm Michael Wybrow, and in this video I'm going to give you an introduction to deep linking on iOS. So you might wonder what deep linking is. Well, deep linking is all about linking to a specific view of an app, and this is not just going to be the initial view controller. So typically how this works is we want to open an app and jump right to a particular place. A really simple example of this might be via the eBay website. If you're viewing a particular option and it sees that you have the iOS app for eBay installed, it might provide a button up the top that says Open in App. And rather than just opening to the main view controller in the eBay app, it will open the eBay app and already be displaying details of the auction that you were just looking at. So this is done via deep linking. There's a couple of options that we have for doing deep linking. One of them is URL schemes, and URL schemes are the same way that we can open a web browser and immediately load a particular page, or we can open the mail app and immediately start composing an email to a particular staff member, in each case just by clicking on a link. So common URL schemes you would have seen would be HTTPS, that's handled by a web browser, or mail to, which is the one that's handled by the mail client. In each case you can provide additional information. We've seen how this can be done via query strings in URLs, and an example would be the mail app. We could say mail to staff member at Monash. You can also add an additional query string where you say $subject equals and specify a subject line, and the mail client will then auto-populate that subject line in the email that's being composed. So how do we use this? We define our own custom URL schemes, and we can have our app open when URLs of that type are clicked on by the user, say in a web page or triggered through an iOS app. It's worth noting the user will be prompted first for safety, just because if you're passing information and then opening an app and running code based on that information, the app could do things you might not want, so you want to make sure that the user intends to open that app. It's worth noting another option for this is universal links. So Apple allow websites to have some JSON embedded in the page, and this JSON can describe what needs to be passed to the app as part of a deep link. And these are more powerful. I mean, this is probably the approach that eBay use. But this requires a paid developer account, so we're not going to have a look at that approach. We're just going to look at URL schemes. So how do we support URL schemes? The app must register that it supports a particular URL scheme. It can register to support something like HTTPS if you're, say, the Google Chrome app, but often times it's going to be just a custom URL scheme. It does this under the info URL types section, and we also need to implement a couple of methods in the scene delegate. It's perhaps interesting here to talk about the fact that there is also a method you can call to find out if a particular URL scheme is supported on iOS based on the apps that are available. It used to be that there were no limitations on this, and nefarious apps, I think Facebook was also caught doing this, could keep a big database of different apps and their custom URL schemes, and then call this API and just ask for each individual URL scheme whether it was supported, and that basically told it was a particular app that supported that URL scheme installed. And this was a great way of them collecting information on as many of the apps as possible that were installed on the user's device. Apple have since limited it, so now you also have to register if you want to find out about particular URL schemes. So you need to register those small number of those when you build your app. Okay, so there are a couple of things we need to do to our scene delegate to support URL schemes. And this caters for two different situations. One where the app is open, where it's not open and it gets launched and the URL is going to be passed to our scene delegates will connect to method. And in this case, in this case, it's via the connection options argument, and it has a URL context property, and we can just take the first URL context and that will contain a URL. If the app is already open, though it may not be in the foreground, then the URL is passed to the scene delegate's open URL contexts method, and we can again just get that URL. So here's an example of that. Here we're just getting the URL property out of the URL context. And I think we already talked about the information that could be provided. Here we just were handling the URL the same way in both cases. Now, how we do this is we get given the URL. You'll see it's just a normal URL object of the kind that we've worked with a lot when we were dealing with web services. You can then, via various properties or methods of the URL class, pull this apart. So we can use the scheme property to read the beginning of it, which for a standard one would be HTTPS. For our custom one, it might be edu.monash.fit3178. We can also get the host, which is the part given after the // bit, and we can also get the query items. So in this case, we create a URL components object from the URL. We query, or we get its query items property, and then we just call for each, and we're giving it a block here. I don't think we've seen this this $0 syntax. This is just a way of referring to a block that just has a single argument, and instead of giving the argument name here and referring to the argument in the code, we can just do $0. So this is quite common if you've ever got a block that is just like one line. So in this case, all we're doing is we're saying for each query item, which is a dictionary entry, we're saying for each entry in it, add the name as the key to the parameters dictionary here, and 0, the first argument's value, property as the value. Now, it's up to you how you structure the URL, but here we're using the host as the view that we're going to open within our app. So let's say it's the forgot password view. We check that case against view name. Then what we do is we look at the parameters, which is information from the query string, and we see, does it have an email property? If so, we're just going to say forgotten password for email this. And this is where we do the work of loading that particular subview of the app. So we're doing this all through code, and we're getting the main window, the root view controller, which we know because we've structured the app that way, is a UI navigation controller. We want to create the view controller we actually want to see, which is a forgotten password view controller, and we do this by asking the storyboard to instantiate a view controller with the forgotten password view controller. And you can see a previous one of my workshops for where this storyboard variable would be coming from in this case. And we know it has this identifier and we can force-cast it, in this case safely, to a forgotten password view controller. We push it onto the navigation controller stack. Importantly, we don't animate this because we want the user to just see this view controller as the app that the app launches onto, rather than seeing any kind of transition. So we do this, and then at this point, the user can just interact with that view controller, and we've successfully launched to a particular place in the app. And you could obviously have different cases for handling different views. Okay, thanks for watching, and we'll look at this more in our workshop demo.